So in January 2016, I was well aware of the Hammond situation. I'd been following that since October, November of 2015. I'd been seeing the editorials that were being published in all the Western livestock journals, Western Livestock Journal out of Denver, Capital Press out of the Northwest, Livestock Weekly out of Texas, Western Ag Journal out of Billings, Montana. They were all talking about the Hammond case. They were talking about the miscarriage of justice that they perceived to be happening to Dwight and Stephen Hammond. So at the time, I was the editor of a blog called the Pavant Post. So I reposted a lot of those editorials on the Pavant Post, and I was well aware of what was going on in Oregon with respect to the Hammonds. But I had no intention of getting involved in the occupation or anything like that once it happened. I didn't go to Oregon originally. I felt like it was a can of worms in terms of the occupation, and I had no intention of getting involved in that at that point. But on January 6th, I was contacted by the Lavoie Finicum family, not by Lavoie, not even by his wife Jeanette, but primarily by his brother Guy. And the Finicums were on their way to Oregon after the occupation had been in process for a few days because they felt like the whole thing, and especially Lavoie, who was their brother, their husband, their father, their son, was being very mischaracterized by the media and what his role was, what he was trying to do there. And so Guy Finicum asked me if I would be willing to go and help them out. And our objectives were basically threefold. First of all, we were going to try to do some damage control. We were going to, especially with respect to the way Lavoie and the whole situation was being portrayed by the media, which from our perspective was very slanted, very single-dimensional, very one-sided. But in addition to that, they wanted to see if I could help them resolve and diffuse the situation. And they also wanted to see if I could help them persuade Lavoie to come home. So those were our three primary objectives. And so we left on January the 7th to head to Oregon. I was with Lavoie's brother Guy and some other people who were part of our party that were setting out to do those things. While we were en route, early that morning, we were in communication with Lavoie, and Guy and I worked together to draft a press release. We did this as we were traveling and someone else was driving. And I'm going to go ahead and read that press release that Guy Finicum and I put together that morning on the 7th of January. It's got the hashtag Oregon Standoff for immediate release, January 7, 2016. And this was drafted to come from Lavoie Finicum because at that time he was basically the spokesman for the occupiers. He'd been given that assignment, and we felt like he was struggling, and they were all struggling with the message that was being portrayed by the media versus what they were trying to portray. So this is what we wrote for him and this was released to a number of media outlets, and this is what Lavoie, this is the statement that he gave that morning. This is what it said. Our message is being distorted and mischaracterized. Reports in the media have tried to portray myself and others as gun-toting militants with a death wish. Nothing could be farther from the truth. I have no death wish. The truth is that we are husbands, fathers, grandfathers, productive members of society. I have been a rancher my whole life. My family has been working to produce beef for this nation for over 100 years. I simply love liberty and freedom. Because of our concerns about how we and our objectives have been portrayed, we won't be saying anything else about our objectives and message until tomorrow, when it will be our intention to have an expanded press conference to clarify and refocus on what this is all about. In the meantime, we want to clarify that we share any and all concerns about safety for everyone involved, including ourselves, our families, the public, and law enforcement officers. All lives are important to us. Ultimately, we want everyone involved to be able to return safely to their homes and families. Our concern about safety is one of the reasons why we chose this remote location. The only reason there are any arms or security here is because we are concerned about our own safety. It is unfortunate that we need to rely on the Second Amendment rights, on our Second Amendment rights to exercise our First Amendment rights. This is and always has been intended to be a peaceful protest and occupation of our public lands. It's our version of Occupy Wall Street. Although this has been characterized as a federal building, it is public land. We are part of the public. The entrance sign to this facility says, "Welcome to your National Wildlife Refuge." We take that seriously. We believe we have a right to be here for peaceful purposes, but we believe we are entitled to be safe, and we know that we are the only ones who can guarantee our own safety. We won't have any more to say until tomorrow. So that was the press release that we helped put together for Lavoie to help maybe send out and better communicate what they were really trying to do and regroup a little bit. Otherwise, once we got there, we spent 2 days. I was there on the 8th and 9th of January. I met with Lavoie, of course. I met with his family. I met with Ammon, Ryan. We talked about what their objectives were, what they were trying to accomplish. And Ammon Bundy made it very clear what he was trying to accomplish. He was attempting to stake a claim, an adverse possession claim at the refuge. He had taken possession, they had taken possession of the refuge, and that's what they were trying to do. They wanted to improve it, they wanted to clean it up, they were doing all kinds of things. I wasn't there to advise them. I was there in an independent mediation role. I wanted to hear what they had to say. I wanted to hear for myself. I wanted to see with my own 2 eyes. I wanted to know exactly what was going on. And so we visited at length about that. The question I asked Ammon at a certain point early on in the conversation was, okay, first of all, what he told me completely changed my perception of what they were trying to do there. I had completely misunderstood what the whole thing was all about. And so I had some paradigm shifts. But what I asked him was, what kind of local support do you have for this? Because any place, whether it's here in Harney County, Oregon, or where I live in rural Utah, or almost any rural county in the West, when a bunch of outsiders come in here and do anything like this, it's going to be not well received by most locals. They're, as a general rule, very conservative. They don't like to see this sort of thing, and so I'm really curious, what kind of support do you have among local ranchers in the local community? And I was really interested to hear what his response was going to be, but he indicated that there was a good show of support. I was skeptical about that, I really was, and so I was really interested in going to the public meeting that evening on the 8th of January in Burns at the Senior Citizens Center. And that meeting was packed. There were probably 500 people there, at least 150 media, 300 plus members of the local community, primarily ranchers. And I'll be honest, I was shocked to see the support and hear what they had to say. And many of them were given an opportunity in a public hearing format to basically express their comments and say what they felt about the whole thing. And I was surprised by what they had to say. I was surprised at the degree of concern in Harney County about the way their federal lands were being managed, the way they were being treated by the federal government, and what is often referred to as federal overreach. I was interested to hear about the repeated concerns expressed about how the federal government had undertaken action to basically destroy their otherwise once viable local economy and take away jobs and drive people off the land, both in terms of productive uses and otherwise. And that was basically what everyone at that meeting was saying. Afterwards, I actually took the opportunity to introduce myself to and meet the members of the Harney County Committee of Safety, Executive Committee, and spent a little bit of time talking to them and finding out what their view was. And what they told me was that they had drafted a letter asking Ammon Bundy to leave the refuge, and they intended to deliver that to them, but they had voted in the executive committee about that, and they all voted that they wanted to deliver the letter, but not yet. They were not yet ready to deliver the letter to Ammon. They were still trying to figure some things out. That was on the 8th of January that happened. The next morning, I again met with Ammon Bundy, and I told him what the safety committee members had said, and I talked to him about his objectives, and I talked to him about an exit strategy. What would it take to get him to pull out and basically turn things over to the local residents, the ranchers, the safety committee, whatever I wanted to know what his requirements were going to be. And one of the biggest requirements was that the Committee of Safety and other local ranchers needed a plan for what to do with the refuge, in terms of he was interested in having the locals basically step into his shoes in terms of asserting an adverse possession claim. And it became obvious to me that that's something that they may not completely understand what his intentions were, and that was going to be one of his requirements for leaving, is to have them have a plan that he would feel good about. So I actually stayed and went and met with them again late that afternoon before I left to return to Utah. And my intention was to tell them, basically convey what his conditions were with respect to an exit strategy as part of my role of trying to resolve and try to see if we couldn't help diffuse that situation and bring some kind of closure to it. And then I returned to Utah, and there's all kinds of speculation about what happened after that, because at a certain point in time, it's true, I organized what we called the Storm Over Rangelands series. And we did that because we felt like with what was going on in Oregon, this was a great opportunity, since most ranchers in the West were paying attention to that. This was a great opportunity. The timing was really good. Number one, it was winter when they didn't have quite as much work going on. Number two, this was an issue that was very fresh in their minds right here, right now. We decided it would be a good opportunity to start talking to ranchers and help educate them about what their rights really are. And one of the main vehicles, one of the main ways that I discovered to do that was through Dr. Angus McIntosh, who had a presentation about those rights and how that whole scenario had changed in the last 50 years with the passage of the Federal Lands Management Act back in 1976. But what he explains in his presentation is a lot of the acts, the Homestead Acts, and all of the congressional acts that occurred prior to that set up the basis for the entire settlement of the West based on prior appropriation and beneficial use, which included appropriation of and beneficial use of the forage resources on these grazing allotments, and that those grazing allotments under those acts were basically treated as private property rights. Now, that doesn't mean that the people who were putting those grazing allotments to beneficial use owned the land per se, but what it did mean under those acts and under the cases that were decided under those acts is that they owned a split estate, a private property interest in the forage estate, because on all of those lands, there are multiple estates, if you will. It's a bundle of sticks that includes the surface estate, the mineral estate, the subsurface estate, the forage estate, the water estate, the recreational estate, the access estate, all of those things. And what Dr. McIntosh's presentation did is spell out how all of those rights were created under the previously enacted acts over a course of probably a century or more. And then what he explains to people is that under FLPMA, again, there are at least 3 mandates, statutory mandates, that are really important here. But FLPMA itself says that the act itself is subject to all valid prior existing rights. So in other words, any private property interests in the split estates that were created prior to 1976, the Act is subject to.